Her name was Isabel Ruiz, and the sound of chains was the first thing she remembered when the blindfold came off. Not the torches, not the men in hoods, not even the steel pyramid waiting in the center of the chamber, like some metallic altar to obedience. No, what burned itself deepest into her memory was that low, scraping rattle of metal links shifting behind her, as if the room itself were exhaling. And for the women dragged into these stone vaults by the Inquisition, that sound meant one thing. The world above had already decided they were guilty. The cold open begins here, because Isabel's story was never a singular tragedy. It was the thread that unravels the larger tapestry of cruelty that authorities insisted was divine order. And tonight, we'll follow that thread from the moment she's unshackled to the moment they lower her onto the impossible edge they claimed would purify her sins. But before we descend into that chamber, the same descent countless women called the staircase to hell, remember this channel is one of the few places left that still names these systems of torment for what they were. If you want more deep history exposés that cut through centuries of silence, subscribe now, because the past doesn't stay buried, especially when it was designed to keep you quiet. Isabel had been pulled from her home just before dawn. The accusation was simple: refusal to confess. That was enough. Her neighbors didn't dare look. Her family wasn't allowed to speak. And the church scribes, sitting safely in warm rooms far away, had already prepared her verdict. In their eyes, confession was the mother tongue of obedience. Silence was rebellion. The chains rattled again. A guard stepped forward and read the charges, though everyone in the room knew they were more performance than law. He spoke of heresy, of female stubbornness, of suspected witchcraft, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Isabel had not bowed her head quickly enough. She had asked questions. She had hesitated. In a world where women were expected to fold themselves into invisibility, her refusal to break became the evidence that she should be broken. The interrogators circled her, robes whispering over the stone floor. They called themselves servants of purity, defenders of truth, but the sound of chains kept filling the air, reminding her that truth here was a weapon designed to clatter, not to illuminate. And then they showed her the device. The Judas Cradle stood barely waist high, a perfect geometric pyramid forged of steel and sharpened at the peak to a surgical point. It looked deceptively simple, like something crafted for ritual rather than agony. One of the hooded men tapped his knuckles against the metal. The hollow ring echoed around the chamber. Another man pulled on the ropes overhead, demonstrating how the victim would be suspended, lowered, held, and adjusted. Every part of it was engineered to take something from her: her movement, her breath, her dignity. As Isabel stared at it, the chains behind her shifted once more. That sound became a heartbeat, a countdown. They always started with the sensory erosion, disorientation, cold, noise. You break a person's world before you break their body. And in these chambers, cruelty wasn't chaotic. It was procedure. She asked one question, just one. Why? Not screamed, not begged, just a quiet, trembling, human why. The chief inquisitor stepped forward, hands clasped in feigned sorrow. His voice softened as if he were a priest comforting a parishioner. "Child," he murmured, "pain is the cleansing fire of the unrepentant. Through suffering, the sinful rise." But Isabel saw the truth. In his eyes, there was no salvation, only control. The chains rattled again. Because in this place, purification was never the goal. Submission was. And what happened next would etch itself into the dark ledger of history. A moment where one woman's descent became the blueprint for fear for generations. This is where the real story begins.
The sound of chains returned long before the pain did, scraping through the chamber as the guards uncoiled the suspension ropes. Isabel felt each metallic shift vibrate through her bones. The sound became the room's second voice, cold, rhythmic, patient. And as they bound her wrists, her ankles, her waist, she realized the entire mechanism of the Judas Cradle wasn't just metal, it was choreography. Every knot, every rope, every pulsing echo of the links was part of a script written long before she entered the room. They lifted her slowly. Her feet left the ground with a soft gasp of air, her body swaying slightly as the ropes pulled taut. The Inquisitors pretended not to look at her exposed skin, a lie so old it had become institutional. They claimed this stripping was symbolic, a removal of worldly disguise. But the truth was simpler, uglier. Humiliation softened the spine. The steel pyramid waited beneath her, its sharpened point glinting in the torchlight like a star that had fallen for the sole purpose of wounding. The device was surprisingly small, almost disappointingly so. For something whispered about with dread, it lacked the theatrical monstrosity of other instruments. But maybe that was its genius, its cruelty hid in its simplicity, a single point multiplied by the weight of the human body. And every inch of descent was agony. One torturer stepped behind her and gave the rope a small tug, just enough to shift her downward by the width of a fingernail. Isabel inhaled sharply. The point touched her, not piercing, not yet, but announcing itself with surgical clarity. The room held its breath. Then the Inquisitor offered his sermon. He always did. They all did. The Judas Cradle was not meant to merely inflict pain. Its genius lay in convincing the victim that their suffering was righteous, a divine correction, a necessary burning away of sin. And for women, the message carried its own venom. They were told their bodies were inherently corrupt, reservoirs of temptation that required pain to reveal the truth buried inside. Your weight, the Inquisitor lectured, will decide how quickly you confess. God has already fashioned the path. You need only descend. Another tug. Another fraction of an inch. Isabel's body tightened involuntarily, muscles clenching, then trembling. She felt the sharp point begin to separate her flesh, not violently, not theatrically, but with slow methodical pressure. Pain bloomed like fire opening its first hungry petals, and still the chains clattered softly above her, reminding her that every gasp, every quiver, every involuntary shift of movement dragged her lower. A rope slipped, whether by accident or design, and her body dropped half an inch in an instant. A raw cry tore out of her throat as the point drove deeper. The torturers didn't flinch. One simply noted her reaction on a parchment, as if documenting livestock behavior. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the way the device weaponized the body against itself. Breathing shifted you downward. Fatigue shifted you downward. Hope, despair, prayer, it didn't matter. Everything pulled you closer to the metal's hunger. The Inquisitors loved to describe this as the soul pressing against the truth. They never mentioned the real motive, because beneath the sermons and scripture lay a system obsessed with control. Women like Isabel were not tortured because they were dangerous. They were tortured because they dared to say no. No to forced confessions, no to fabricated accusations, no to a world where obedience mattered more than truth. And nothing enforced obedience like a device that made your own body betray you. As Isabel hung there, suspended between agony and the promise of more, she realized something the Inquisitors never intended her to understand. The torture wasn't meant to extract truth. It was meant to erase it, to hollow her out until the only words she could form were the ones they wanted. The chains rattled again, and the descent continued. The sound of chains was the first thing Isabel heard when she woke, if waking was even the right word for the drifting, half-conscious state she found herself in. The links clinked overhead as the torturers adjusted her ropes, not to ease her pain, but to prepare her for the next round of persuasion. That metallic rattle marked time in the chamber, replacing clocks, replacing daylight, replacing any sense of a world where mercy existed. But something had changed. Her body hung lower now, not because they had lowered her, but because exhaustion had dragged her down inch by inch. That was the hidden cruelty of the Judas Cradle. Even in stillness, you descended. Even in silence, you suffered. The device asked nothing of its victim except the simple fact of being alive. And yet, when the Inquisitor stepped toward her, quill in hand, he did not begin by asking for confession. He began with disappointment. "You should have told us the truth yesterday," he murmured, shaking his head. "It saddens us to see you struggle so." His voice was so soft, so calculated, that for a moment it almost sounded like concern. That was the psychological snare. He wanted her to believe they were reluctant participants in her agony, that she had done this to herself. But Isabel felt a new heat rising inside her. Not the burning pain from below, but something sharper, something she thought the torture would have extinguished: anger. The Inquisitor noticed it. He stepped closer, studying her expression, and the moment he saw that flicker of defiance, his smile faded. Control was slipping, and to the Inquisition, a woman who did not break became something worse than a heretic. She became a threat to the system itself. He signaled to the torturers. They tightened the ropes, slowly, deliberately. Each pull forced her body downward by increments so small they might have been invisible, but Isabel felt every one. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. The point beneath her pressed deeper with a whispering internal pressure that made the world tilt. Another pull. The chains above her groaned. And then something happened the Inquisitors did not expect. Isabel laughed. Not madness, not surrender. A hollow, cracked laugh, born from the unbearable realization that the pain had climbed so far beyond the boundaries of language that fear itself had burned away. For the first time, the men in the chamber stepped back. That laugh, raw, uninvited, broke the script. Victims were supposed to scream, beg, faint, repent. They were never supposed to laugh. The Chief Inquisitor hissed the command, and the guards moved forward to silence her. But in that fractured moment, Isabel understood the truth that centuries of propaganda had tried to bury. The Judas Cradle wasn't invented to cleanse sin. It was invented to erase resistance. Not just hers, everyone's. Because the Inquisition wasn't hunting witches. It was hunting autonomy, hunting the possibility that a woman could think for herself, speak for herself, or question the authority that claimed to speak directly for God. Isabel's laugh died out as the next adjustment dragged her downward, forcing a strangled gasp from her lips. Pain returned in a crushing wave. Her body trembled violently. She clutched at the ropes with shaking hands, fighting against gravity, fighting against betrayal by her own muscles. But the shock was still coming. The Inquisitor leaned forward and whispered, "Confess now, and we will lift you." She looked up, eyes unfocused. "Lift me? Where?" she managed. "To safety," he promised. And that was the moment. The unpredictable, brutal truth that history tried to hide. There was no intention of lifting her at all. Many women who confessed under torture were never freed. Their confessions became evidence for execution, not release. The stairway to hell had only one direction. Isabel realized it, and for the first time, the sound of chains didn't frighten her. It enraged her. Her voice cracked, but the words came out clear. "I have nothing to confess." Silence fell. Even the chains seemed to pause. What happened next would ignite rumors across villages, terrify inquisitors, and reshape the hidden chronicles of resistance. Because her refusal set off a chain reaction the torturers had never prepared for and could not control.
For her long after the chamber faded, echoing in memory, in nightmares, in the quiet moments where breath trembles but the body survives. For Isabel, that metallic rattle became the defining motif of her escape, not from the Inquisition, but from the destiny it tried so violently to carve into her flesh. And yes, she did escape. Not in triumph, not in glory, but in the smallest crack of negligence the torturers never imagined a woman would exploit. It happened hours after her final refusal. Her body had gone limp, not in surrender, but in conservation. The Inquisitors, assuming she was close to fading into unconsciousness, loosened the supporting rope so her weight would finish what they had begun. But they misjudged. Exhaustion had made her arms slip through the bindings. Sweat had softened the knots. Her muscles, trembling and numb, shifted just enough. One wrist came free. Only an inch, only a fraction, but that slippage was salvation. The torturers left, believing she could not move, believing the device had already crippled her will. And in the dim hours before dawn, when the chamber was left unguarded except for a single drowsy novice, Isabel forced her mind back into her body. Every movement sent new shockwaves of agony through her. The point beneath her tore deeper. Her vision swam, but she kept pushing her weight toward the loosened rope. It took nearly an hour, but finally, the rope slipped entirely off her wrist. Her arm fell. A thud. A chain swayed. The novice startled awake, but in his panic, he stepped forward too quickly, tripping over the slack rope, knocking the stand that balanced the pulley system. And in that wild instant of chaos, Isabel dropped, not onto the spike, but sideways, collapsing in a heap on the chamber floor. The guards rushed in, but she was already crawling, half blind, half dead, driven only by something the Inquisition had tried so hard to extinguish: the instinct to live. What followed was not cinematic. It was not dramatic. It was not heroic. It was desperate. She crawled across stone. She dragged herself through corridors meant only for prisoners and rats. She stumbled out a side door left unlatched by a careless hand. And when villagers found her at dawn, bloodied and barely conscious in the grass beneath the monastery hill, they whispered that perhaps God had intervened. But Isabel knew the truth. She didn't survive because of divine mercy. She survived because cruelty is never as flawless as it pretends to be. Systems built on fear always underestimate the people they brutalize. And centuries later, the echoes of her story are not distant at all, because the methods have changed, but the motive remains familiar. Societies still punish women who question. Institutions still reward obedience over truth. And fear, weaponized fear, still sits at the center of so many systems of control. The Judas Cradle is gone, but its logic is not. Every time someone is told to stay silent for their own good, every time a voice is dismissed as hysterical, ungrateful, sinful, or disruptive, every time power wraps itself in moral purity to justify violence, the same ancient machinery rattles to life. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. That sound of chains. Those links of intimidation, tradition, expectation, binding people to structures built centuries ago. The faces change, the uniforms change, but the architecture of control remains chillingly recognizable. So the question becomes one we can't sidestep. When cruelty disguises itself as righteousness, who are we expected to be? Silent participants, or the ones who finally break the chain? As we close this chapter of the Crimson Archive, carry Isabel's defiance with you. Carry the knowledge that even in the darkest chambers of history, someone resisted, someone said no, someone refused to confess to a lie. And if you want more exposés that pull back the curtain on the past's most brutal secrets, stories the world tried to bury, subscribe to the channel. The archive is deep, the shadows are long, and there are countless voices still waiting to be heard. Until next time, listen closely. The chains are still echoing.